Deborah Fowler is the Deputy Director of Texas Appleseed, a legal support group dedicated to finding practical solutions to difficult systemic problems. Deborah coordinates their legal efforts concerning juvenile justice, foster care reform, mental health and the courts, the school-to-prison pipeline, parent involvement in schools, and disaster relief. She is the primary author of the group's School-to-Prison Pipeline report, which chronicles the growing trend toward criminalizing bad behavior in school. Deborah holds a bachelor's degree from Tulane University and a Juris Doctor from Lewis and Clark College's Northwestern School of Law. She previously served as Texas Appleseed's legal director. Deborah Fowler, welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on the show, Brent.
Thanks so much. One of your listed responsibilities as deputy director is to coordinate disaster relief. For what kinds of disaster?
Well, we really became involved in disaster relief work as a result of Hurricane Katrina, and then unfortunately soon after the many hurricanes we've had in Texas since Katrina. So most of our work is focused on trying to help survivors find their way through the maze of disaster relief services.
I only asked because it was almost like this one doesn't match all the others kind of thing.
Right,
and,
yeah.
You've got extensive experience working in the judiciary. You worked as a law clerk, a supervising attorney. You've done a lot of pro bono work. How would you characterize the juvenile justice system these days? How well or poorly is it functioning?
Well, in Texas, we've actually been through some pretty significant restructuring of our juvenile justice system. We have focused, along with one of our very conservative advocacy organizations here in Texas, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, on trying to ensure that we're using cost-effective means to get the best outcomes for community safety and for rehabilitating youth. And so in Texas, we've seen a big move away from the use of expensive and far-flung state secure facilities and toward the use of community-based treatment closer to home for youth, principally because they are less expensive to operate and they show much better outcomes.
Well, and I appreciate that there's a difference between theory, we're going to do this, and implementation. Are the good intentions that you've just described, have they been implemented?
They have been. In Texas, we have seen over the last 4 years a shift away from the use of expensive state facilities and toward community-based alternatives. It's saved the state of Texas somewhere around $100 million and is treating youth with better outcomes. So we in Texas, of course, I think we still have room for improvement and a long way to go, but we have seen a significant progress over just the last 4 years.
Excellent. So overall, would you say when you look, and I'm not asking you to compare it with the rest of the country, I'm not asking you to, just say what's good or say what's bad, but overall, from your experience, do you think that the juvenile justice system is functioning well, or is it in some way not accomplishing its objective?
I think not, and we have to distinguish between the juvenile justice system and the problems associated with what we are going to talk about.
Yes, I'm specifically asking about the system right now.
Right. The system as a whole in Texas is I think doing well compared to the rest of the country. We've been able to recognize a shift in placing our services at the front end for youth where they're less expensive and you see better outcomes, better rehabilitation, which translates to better community safety. We've been able to do this despite the fact that other states have been trying and have not been as successful. So I'm very optimistic about the direction that we're headed and the state of the system today, certainly as compared to 4 years ago.
You mentioned something, you used a word 2 times. The word is rehabilitation. When I look around me in today's America, I see that the ordinary justice system seems to be more concerned with punishment than rehabilitation. Is that true of the juvenile justice system? What is the primary objective these days of that system? Is it rehabilitation or is it punishment?
Well, of course, the stated primary objective of the juvenile justice system, whether you are talking about Texas's system or the system in any state in the nation, is to rehabilitate youth. That was one of the purposes for creating a system specifically for juveniles back when we had the wisdom and foresight to do so many years ago. We did see a movement away in the late 80s, early 90s from rehabilitation and toward an increased focus on punishment, and that was true for both the adult and the juvenile justice system. What we're seeing now is that because so many of the get tough measures that were implemented in the late 80s, early 90s have really failed to make our communities safer and are often much more expensive, we see policymakers now trying to peel back some of those measures and really focus again on what will work to hold youth accountable, but at the same time rehabilitate them so that they don't become involved in a chronic life of.
Well, the reason I ask the question is because we have this trend in our schools these days, and you know this because you wrote a report called the School to Prison Pipeline, and this trend is that somebody does something that's bad behavior in school, and in my day, and probably in your day, it might be a trip to the principal's office or something of that sort. Today, they call in the cops, they have them handcuffed, they bring them down in front of a judge. What exactly is the School to Prison Pipeline?
Sure. And, this is one of the interesting things that we've seen is that despite the fact that certainly our policymakers, when it comes to juvenile justice, are beginning to shift and focus more on rehabilitation, that message doesn't seem to have permeated our school discipline system yet. In our school discipline systems, at the same time that we saw a shift toward more punitive measures in the juvenile system, we also saw a shift toward zero-tolerance discipline in schools. And so many of the kind of absurd stories that we hear about so often of, kids getting caught with a butter knife at school and being expelled for having a butter knife, or some of the absurd stories that we've heard nationwide about really extreme, seemingly harsh.
How about just a child pointing his finger at somebody like he's playing cowboys?
Right, exactly. And so many of these stories, and it's true of every state in the nation. It's not true just of Texas. We're not an outlier on this. But so, we saw this real movement away from a more common sense approach that probably was in place certainly when I was in school and I would guess when you were in school, and toward this very punitive approach to student discipline. What we're finding, unfortunately, is that for many of the same reasons that it didn't work in juvenile justice, it doesn't work in student discipline either, and it leads often to very poor life outcomes for kids, both academic outcomes. It leads to increased rates of school alienation and dropouts, but it also leads to, now we know very definitively, to increased involvement in the juvenile justice system.
Let me interrupt. You speak with authority, meaning that the information is not coming out of your head. That's clear information, that there have been studies, there have been results. Why is it the schools are doing this if those are the clear results over time to this kind of behavior? How and why did our schools go from where they were when you and I were in school to treating children this way today?
Well, again, we had a lot of fear, and some of that fear was justified. We saw some terrible acts of extreme violence in the 80s and 90s. Columbine is the example that people most often turn to, and as a result, tried to put into place measures that we thought would be likely to keep students safe. Unfortunately, what we're finding is that they, in fact, often have exactly the opposite effect. They fail to make schools safer, and they lead to, again, to very poor outcomes for youth.
And like you said, this is not a Texas problem. This is pretty extensive. So it's out there. We know it's happening. We know it's a problem, and we know that the current system, perpetuates the problem. Is anybody doing anything to combat the trend? Is there any effort like you say, that the justice system, juvenile justice system, at least in Texas, is starting to be a little bit more toward, they're moving towards rehabilitation. Is anything happening on the education side to change the current paradigm?
Well, I think that particularly in the wake of some of the information that is now widely available about, for example, the problem with students receiving Class C misdemeanor tickets and some of the absurdities associated with that, we are seeing policymakers who are really questioning the utility and the efficacy of the systems that are in place, as well as the costs associated with both the very real financial costs to schools and to families and to communities, as well as the cost to our youth.
What was your objective, or the objective of Texas Appleseed, in writing the report "School to Prisons Pipeline"? What were you trying to accomplish?
We wanted to raise awareness about both what the data tells us about what kids are getting disciplined for, and how useful and appropriate and how results-oriented those methods are. And so we think that our policymakers now have a better awareness of the failure of these zero-tolerance measures to ensure that schools are safe, and that it's actually costing our communities and our families quite a bit.
What about the politics of this? Has the legislature become involved in this issue?
They have. And during this past legislative session, we saw some very good measures put into place to curb the number of Class C misdemeanor tickets that are being given to youth. And this is one of the probably the most recent discoveries that Texas Appleseed made about what's going on in schools. What we found with the last report that we published that focused on the impact of the increased use of school police was that hundreds of thousands of kids in Texas are being issued Class C misdemeanor tickets for behavior that is as innocuous as, throwing paper airplanes at the ceiling of a classroom, which was characterized as disruption of class, and for which a youth was given a ticket here in Austin and sent to court.
Well, now that was going to be the next thing I was going to even ask you about, because it seems to me that, and I've been exposed to a lot of these stories, not just in Texas but all over the country, and it seems to me that judges are going to have these ridiculous cases brought in front of them. I mean, right. What do the judges do? Do they treat them seriously? Do they come down upon the school for, what are you bringing this in front of me for? I mean, what happens there?
Judges have been one of our closest allies in our push toward reform. In Connecticut recently, the judicial branch actually issued policy and made school police and school administrators aware that they were no longer going to tolerate students being referred to the court system for things like running in the halls, refusing to remove a hat, possession of a soda, I think was
possession of a soda
that they specifically referred to. And so we do see the judiciary becoming an ally in our fight to change this issue.
But have you ever been in court where one of these incidents came before a juvenile judge? And I kind of wonder whether the judge says, why are you wasting my time bringing this matter before me?
Right.
Do they actually rule in these matters, or do they just throw them out, or?
Well, you would think that they would throw them out far more often than they do, and part of it may have to do with the way that our system is set up in Texas, that courts, often judges feel like if the prosecutor wants to pursue the case, that they may not have the ability to dismiss it. But I have been in court and watched the proceedings and seen some of the ridiculous cases before judges who are clearly exasperated and ask those questions. Why is this use?
And from Deer Tick in the chat room, in my opinion, it is cash for juveniles. Now, that raises a question. Is there some kind of, I don't know if this applies under the juvenile justice system or what, but I do know that there are many arenas in government where, for example, the private prison system where they will pay the prison a certain amount to keep a prisoner in prison for another day. And there's an inherent conflict there. Does money enter into the picture here with sending students through the system? Do the schools receive any kind of money for that? Do the system receive any kind of money when this type of stuff happens?
Well, and this is one of the oddities of the Texas system. In Texas, when a youth gets a Class B misdemeanor ticket, which is very much like a traffic ticket that we would get if a police officer pulled us over on the side of the road for speeding, they don't go through the juvenile court system. They actually go to our municipal or our justice courts, which are adult criminal court forums. And so they're subject to the same penalties that an adult would have in a similar circumstance. And so rather than going through the juvenile court system that focuses on connecting youth with services and making sure that they're trying to rehabilitate the youth, in the municipal and the JP court systems, often the youth is just given a fine. The fine can be up to $500, and then there are court costs on top of the fine. So, yes, in fact, there can be revenues associated with the Class C misdemeanor ticket use.
Which creates a whole nother level of complexity in trying to unravel any injustice in the system. What happens to children, and I know you can't speak for everyone, but it's just as a general rule, what happens to children subjected to courtrooms? Now, I know of one instance where they actually handcuffed a child, put the child into a police car just to scare him, never even brought him before court, just to scare him. I would imagine by the time some of these children get into a court with the judge sitting up above on his bench and all that, looking down on the child, it must be traumatic. Is there some pattern? Do they go on to be adult criminals? Do they go on to be model citizens?
Well, that's exactly the problem, and it's one of the concerns that we have, is that there have been some very sound studies done that show that when youth have a first contact with a court system, they become much more likely to drop out of school and much more likely to further penetrate either the juvenile justice or the adult criminal justice system. So court contact in and of itself is associated with very poor outcomes. And so we need to really be sure that when we're sending kids to court, that we're sending kids who really need that kind of serious intervention, not just the kid who's talking too much in class or running in the hallway.
Do they tend, and you may not know the answer to this, but does it tend to be more of a stigma to the child going back into school after one of these, or more of some kind of a badge of honor?
Well, we talk with students about zero tolerance discipline and about ticketing, and what they tell us is that what they often see is that once a kid gets in trouble for that first time in school, they're often labeled as a troublemaker by teachers, and that they're much more likely then to get into trouble again. In some of these cases where we hear from parents and students, what we're hearing is that students may be getting not just one ticket, but multiple tickets. We heard from one parent whose son, who had some pretty serious mental health issues, actually, and should have been receiving treatment for his mental health issues, had received something like 11 tickets and had fines in excess of $1,500. And this was a mom who was struggling just to get by, and she said, $1,500 for me might as well be $1 million.
Well, you mentioned the parents, and I'm curious about them. Are parents generally involved in these situations? I've known of numerous stories where the parents find out after the fact in terms of the incident, but of course they're involved, through the court process. Are the parents part of the problem, or are the parents part of the solution in general?
Well, of course, it's hard to make generalizations about parents. I have talked to parents and been contacted by parents whose kids have been ticketed, who are obviously very, very involved parents, very good advocates for their children. So I think it's hard to generalize. I can say that for the court appearances, the parents do have to go to court with their kids, which of course can result in has an impact then on the whole family if the parent is having to take the day off of work and go to court with the kid, it means the family itself loses income in addition to whatever fine is being imposed on the youth. But I've talked to parents who are certainly involved, parents who care deeply about their children and are somewhat flabbergasted by the fact that, their 12-year-old just got a ticket at school. It seems so alien to, I think, most adult experience.
Well, have you encountered the other side of parents, the parents who perhaps just don't give any attention to their children, so their children go out and do all kinds of outrageous things and cries for attention, resulting in a violation and a trip to court and all that? Do you ever encounter those parents who are the exact opposite, who are actually precipitating the problem? Or, you know what I'm asking?
Sure. I mean, and it would be naive to think that those parents don't exist. We all know that they do. I am far less likely to hear from that kind of parent, obviously, than I am to hear from a parent who is very proactive and involved. I can tell you one story that I found heartbreaking that a chief probation officer recounted to me of a young man who was referred to the juvenile system for truancy. He had been repeatedly shown up late at school, which can result in a truancy charge for a child in Texas. And when the chief probation officer asked the kid what was going on, the kid told him that his mother was an alcoholic and had been spending the evenings at the local VFW hall, which is a social hub in many small Texas towns. And when she came home drunk, she would beat him up. And so in order to avoid the beatings, he had learned to go and spend the night in the local public park, but was still, despite that, getting up every morning and going to school. Of course, he was late. He didn't have an alarm clock. He didn't have any way of getting to school except to walk. And what was astonishing to me about that was that the school's response, rather than sitting down with the youth and saying, Johnny, why are you late to school every morning? What's going on? Was just to refer him to the juvenile justice system, where they had to discover what was going on with the youth.
There's something wrong with that. There's some fundamental wrongness with that. A couple of comments from the chat room from Deer Tick. They started the Scared Straight program in 1979-1980 in New Jersey for the so-called bad kids, where they were taken to a prison for a visit to get scared by the prisoners. I only knew one kid from our high school who went through that program. And then we have from Starscream, I went through that Scared Straight deal in 1968. Our whole class in Florida was taken to prison to be scared. God, we're trying to frighten our children into proper behavior?
Right, and the Scared Straight programs have actually been pretty well debunked. They really don't work. So it's not an effective way for us to teach our children the right way to behave, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I can't help but wonder how it is that we've come to such a point. To your knowledge, I know you speak highly of Texas's efforts to revamp and reform its system. To your knowledge, are there other states that are like on a par there that are working on this program or something similar, this problem?
I think that there are states nationwide that are both actively working to find solutions or have already started to put some solutions into place. I know Colorado, for example, recently passed an act that will require them to create a task force to find ways to encourage schools to use more effective methods to discipline students, to really get away from some of the zero-tolerance practices. I mentioned the Connecticut judicial branch's efforts to reduce the ridiculous court referrals that they had seen. But, yeah, there are nationwide, you see a movement away and certainly a great deal of advocacy to move schools to use common sense and to really move away from some of these punitive practices.
How would you suggest people become more involved in this issue? How can they make a difference and perhaps influence changes in the system?
Well, they are certainly welcome to contact me at Texas Appleseed or to go to our website, www.texasappleseed.net, to take a look at some of the resources that we have. We have, in addition to our reports, we also have a guide for parents whose children may be involved in this.
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. That website again, www.texasappleseed.net. Deborah, is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure people know? Any final thoughts?
I don't think so. It was a pleasure talking with you today, Brent. I really appreciate y'all's interest in this issue.
Well, and I'll tell you, it breaks my heart every time I read one of these stories about a child being hauled off in handcuffs. It absolutely breaks my heart. And I'm not a parent. Deborah Fowler, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Deborah Fowler has been my guest. She's Deputy Director of Texas Appleseed, www.texasappleseed.net. And God bless you in the work you're doing.
Thanks so much.